I am your host, Mr. Hercule.
Now, shall we begin our little investigation?
The snow fell upon Blackwood Manor with a silent, relentless industry, blanketing the rolling hills of the English countryside in a shroud of deceptive purity. Inside the great hall, however, the atmosphere was anything but pure. It was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, aged brandy, and the palpable, jagged tension that often precedes a storm. Sir Alister Vane stood by the towering hearth, his shadow elongated by the flickering orange flames until it climbed the oak-panelled walls like a dark, reaching hand. He was a man of 60, built like an iron fortress, with eyes that had spent 40 years looking for weakness in his business rivals and finding it. He held a crystal tumbler of whiskey with a grip that suggested he might crush it at any moment. 10 minutes, Sir Alister remarked, his voice a low growl that cut through the polite murmur of his guests. He did not look at them. He looked at the grandfather clock that stood like a sentry near the library door. 10 minutes until the old year dies, and with it, the old ways of this house. The guests shifted. There were 5 of them, excluding the silent servants who moved like ghosts in the periphery. Lady Margaret, his wife, sat stiffly on the velvet settee, her pearls gleaming against a throat that moved with a nervous swallow. Julian, his son and heir apparent, stood by the window, staring out at the white abyss, his fingers drumming a frantic, rhythmic beat against his thigh. Then there was Eleanor, the niece with the sharp wit and the empty pockets, Dr. Arbuthnot, the family physician whose tired eyes seemed to know too many secrets, and Captain Hastings, who felt remarkably out of place in such a den of domestic discord. "Alistair, darling, must we?" Lady Margaret's voice was a fragile thread. "It is New Year's Eve. Surely the business of the estate can wait until tomorrow." "Tomorrow is for the living, Margaret," Sir Alister said, finally turning to face them. His smile was a grimace of cold satisfaction. "At the stroke of midnight, I shall sign the new codicil. I have realized that loyalty is a commodity I can no longer afford to overpay for. I think you all know what that means." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the great clock. It was a sound that seemed to grow louder, more insistent, counting down the seconds of a fortune. "I'm going to the study," Sir Alister announced, draining his glass. "I wish to be alone with my thoughts and my pen until the bells toll. I suggest the rest of you find some way to look festive. It would be a pity to ring in the new year with such long faces." He turned on his heel and strode toward the library, the heavy mahogany doors groaning as he shut them behind him. A moment later, the audible click of a key turning in the lock echoed through the hall. "He's mad," Julian whispered, his voice shaking. "He's going to ruin us all." "He is a man of his word," Dr. Arbuthnot sighed, rubbing his temples. A hard word, usually, but his word nonetheless. The minutes began to crawl. To Hastings, it felt as though the very air in the room had become pressurized. He checked his pocket watch. 11:55. Lady Margaret began to weep silently, the sound muffled by a lace handkerchief. Eleanor lit a cigarette, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. 11:58. The wind howled against the leaded glass windows, a mournful cry that seemed to herald an ending rather than a beginning. 11:59. The guests stood as if mesmerized by the grandfather clock. The long gold hand twitched, hovering over the final mark. Then, the first chime of midnight began. It was a deep, resonant bong that vibrated in the floorboards. Bong. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The great hall was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. A woman screamed, a short, sharp sound of pure terror. Bong. There was the sound of a heavy thud from the direction of the library, followed by the crystalline shatter of breaking glass. Bong. The lights. "Get the lights," Julian shouted, his voice cracking in the dark. Hastings fumbled for his matches, his heart hammering against his ribs. By the time he struck a flame, the 6th chime was echoing through the house. The servants appeared with candles, their faces pale masks of fright. "Sir Alister!" Hastings cried, rushing toward the library doors. He threw his weight against the mahogany, but the lock held firm. "Sir Alister, open the door!" There was no answer, only the fading vibration of the 12th chime and the whistle of the wind. "The spare key!" Dr. Arbuthnot shouted to the butler. "Fetch it, man! Quickly!" Seconds felt like hours. When the heavy door finally swung open, the scene inside was a tableau of frozen violence. The study was cold. The French windows leading to the snowy terrace stood wide open, the curtains lashing in the wind like tattered wings. Sir Alister Vane was slumped across his massive desk. The pen he had intended to use lay on the floor dry. The new codicil was nowhere to be seen, but it was the crimson stain spreading across the white blotter that drew every eye. Sir Alister was dead, a single precise wound to the temple marking the end of his reign. Hastings stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the desk, then at the open window, and finally at the gathered, trembling suspects in the doorway. "God help us," he whispered. "No, Hastings." A calm, melodic voice spoke from the shadows of the hallway behind them. "God has provided the tragedy. It is up to the little grey cells to provide the solution." Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a fur-lined overcoat, his moustaches waxed to a point of lethal perfection, stood Hercule Poirot. He looked at the body, then at the clock, and finally at the open window with a look of profound disapproval. "The order," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing. "It has been most rudely disturbed." Hercule Poirot stepped into the room, his patent leather shoes clicking with rhythmic precision on the hardwood floor. He did not immediately approach the body of Sir Alister. Instead, he walked directly to the open French windows. With a small grunt of effort, he pulled them shut and turned the latch. The howling wind was abruptly silenced, replaced by the heavy, funereal quiet of the study. "The draughts, they are the enemies of the Constitution," Poirot remarked, adjusting his silk cravat. He then turned his gaze toward the group huddled in the doorway. "And you, my friends, look as though you have seen a ghost. But it is not a ghost that has visited Blackwood Manor. It is something far more corporeal and far more definitive." He moved to the desk, his eyes darting like quicksilver over the arrangement of objects. Sir Alister lay face down, his cheek resting against a leather-bound ledger. The bullet had entered his temple with surgical accuracy. Poirot's nose crinkled. He leaned down, not to touch the wound, but to sniff the air near the dead man's shoulder. "Captain Hastings," Poirot said, beckoning with a gloved hand, "you were here when the lights failed. Tell me, did you hear the shot?" Hastings stepped into the room, his face pale. "No, Poirot, not a shot. I heard a thud and the sound of breaking glass. I assumed that was the window, but the chimes of the clock were so loud, so insistent, they seemed to drown out everything else." "Precisely," Poirot murmured. "The synchronization was most opportune for the assassin. Now let us observe the circle of our mourners." He turned to face the suspects, who had begun to filter into the room, drawn by a morbid necessity. Lady Margaret was the first. She had regained a terrifying sort of composure, her face a mask of powdered marble. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes fixed not on her husband, but on the empty space on the desk where the new codicil should have been. "He was going to take everything away," she whispered, her voice devoid of its earlier fragility. "He was going to leave us with nothing but the name, and a name does not pay the taxes on an estate like this. And you, Monsieur Julien?" Poirot's eyes fell upon the son. Julien Van was trembling, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his evening jacket. There was a faint smudge of something dark on his cuff, ink, perhaps, or something more sinister. "You stood by the window in the hall. You seemed anxious for the year to end." "I wanted it over with," Julien snapped, his voice cracking. "My father was a tyrant. He used his wealth like a whip. We were all waiting for him to strike, Poirot, every one of us. You can't tell me that anyone in this house is truly grieving. A harsh sentiment, but perhaps an honest one," Poirot conceded. He shifted his attention to Eleanor, the niece. She was standing apart from the others, her arms crossed, watching the scene with a cynical detachment. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper eyes. "And you, Mademoiselle Eleanor? You are the poor relation, are you not? The one who relies on the generosity of the great Sir Alister." Eleanor let out a short, jagged laugh. "Generosity? My uncle didn't have a generous bone in his body. He kept me here as a glorified secretary because it was cheaper than hiring a professional. If that codicil had been signed, I would have been on the street by morning. So, if you're looking for a motive, Monsieur Poirot, You can put my name at the top of the list. I'm sure it's a crowded list anyway." Finally, Poirot looked at Dr. Arbuthnot. The physician had stepped toward the body, his professional instincts momentarily overriding the shock. He reached out to touch Sir Alister's wrist, but Poirot's voice stopped him like a physical barrier. "Do not disturb the symmetry, Doctor. The dead have a story to tell, but they are very sensitive to interruptions." Arbuthnot drew back, his brow furrowed. "I was only going to confirm that he is dead?" "That is quite evident, Poirot. What is more interesting is the timing. You have been the family physician for many years, have you not? You knew the state of Sir Alister's health, and perhaps the state of his secrets." Arbuthnot's jaw tightened. "A doctor's first duty is to his patient's privacy even after death." "How noble," Poirot remarked, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. He walked a slow circle around the room, his eyes scanning the plush Persian rug. He stopped near the fireplace. A small, charred fragment of paper lay near the grate, barely escaping the embers. Poirot did not pick it up. He simply stared at it, his head tilted to one side. The door was locked from the inside, Poirot mused, almost to himself. The windows were closed but not latched until I touched them. The lights, they failed at the exact moment of the crime. It is a locked room puzzle of the most exquisite variety. Every person in this hall had the motive to stop that pen from touching the paper. And yet, the paper is gone, and Sir Alister has been silenced. He turned back to the group, his expression suddenly stern. "None of you must leave this house. The snow has seen to it that the police will be delayed, but the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot are not hampered by the weather. Somewhere in this room or in your hearts is the truth, and I shall find it." Poirot did not immediately begin a frantic search for clues in the manner of a bloodhound. Instead, he took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and carefully dusted a small velvet chair that sat near the library wall. Only when he was satisfied with its cleanliness did he sit, crossing his legs with such precision that the crease in his trousers remained perfectly sharp. He looked like a man about to enjoy a quiet evening at the opera, rather than a man sitting 3 feet away from a cooling corpse. "Now," Poirot said, his voice humming with a soft, dangerous energy. "We shall have the order, we shall have the method. Without them, we are but children playing in the dark, and as we have seen, the dark in this house is a very dangerous thing indeed." He gestured vaguely toward the body of Sir Alister. "The death, it occurred during the darkness. The lights, they failed at the stroke of midnight. Is that not so, Hastings?" "Exactly then, Poirot," Hastings replied, stepping closer. "The first chime had just sounded. The house went black for perhaps, I should say a full minute, maybe 2. It felt like an eternity. A minute is an eternity for a man who knows what he wants to do," Poirot remarked. He turned his eyes toward the butler, who was still hovering near the door, his face the color of old parchment. "You, the good servant. Where is the box of the fuses, the thing that makes the light go pop?" "In the cellar, monsieur," the butler stammered, "under the stairs at the far end of the kitchen wing." "And was it a natural failure? A surfeit of festive electricity, perhaps?" The butler shook his head. "No, monsieur. I went to check it immediately after the lights came back on. The main fuse had been pulled out, removed by hand. It was lying on the floor. A low murmur went through the suspects." Poirot nodded, his expression almost bored. "So, an intentional darkness. Someone left the hall, descended to the cellar, pulled the fuse, and then what? They returned to the hall to wait? Or did they make their way here, to the library in the shadows?" "The library door was locked from the inside," Julian Vane reminded him, his voice tight. "My father turned the key himself. We all heard it. How could anyone have come in through the door in the dark without a key?" "A most pertinent question," Poirot said. He rose and walked back to the massive mahogany door. He examined the lock. The key was still protruding from the keyhole on the inside of the room. The key, it remains in the lock. If one has the key on the inside, one cannot easily enter from the outside, even with a duplicate. It is a barrier, the most formidable. He then walked back to the French windows. He had closed them earlier, but now he leaned down, his nose nearly touching the glass. He peered out at the terrace. The snow was a smooth, unbroken sheet of white. "Look, Hastings. The snow, it is a storyteller that does not lie. It began to fall heavily at 10 o'clock. If an assassin had come from the outside, or fled into the night after the deed, he would have left. his signature in the white carpet. But look, it is as smooth as the icing on a wedding cake. No footprints come to the window, no footprints lead away. Then the killer was already in the room, Eleanor said, her voice sharp, but the door was locked. Are you suggesting my uncle killed himself? Dr. Arbuthnot stepped forward, his professional mask slipping for a moment. Impossible. Look at the angle of the wound, Poirot. The shot was fired from at least 3 feet away. There is no scorching of the skin, no powder burns. It was not suicide. It was an execution. An execution, Poirot repeated, the word hanging in the air. And where, pray tell, is the instrument of this execution? I see no pistol. I see no revolver. A man is shot from 3 feet away in a locked room, and the weapon, it vanishes into the air. It is like the magic of the stage, is it not? Poirot began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped at the edge of the desk, his eyes fixed on the exact spot where Sir Alister's hand rested. Near the dead man's fingers was a small circular stain on the wood, not of blood, but of water, a single melting snowflake, or something else. You mentioned a thud, Hastings, Poirot said suddenly, and the sound of breaking glass. Yes, just after the lights went out. Poirot looked at the floor near the window. A few shards of glass lay scattered on the rug. He picked one up with his handkerchief. This glass, it is not from the window pane. The window is intact. This glass is thin, curved, like the glass of a picture frame, or perhaps a heavy vase. He looked around the room. On the mantelpiece sat a collection of silver-framed photographs. One of them lay face down, the glass shattered. Poirot straightened it. It was a photograph of a young woman, her face filled with a light that seemed entirely absent from the current inhabitants of Blackwood Manor. "Who is this?" Poirot asked. Lady Margaret glanced at it and then looked away quickly. "That was Cecilia, Alister's first wife. She died many years ago." "I see," Poirot whispered. "The past. It also attends our New Year's party. It sits in the corner and watches." He turned to the suspects, his eyes turning cold and sharp. "The situation, it is this. A man is dead in a room that no one could enter. The document that would have disinherited you all is gone. The weapon is gone. And yet, the killer is among us. You look at me and you see a small man with a funny mustache. But I tell you now, I see the truth. I see the threads that connect you to this desk, and I shall pull them until the whole tapestry unravels." He checked his pocket watch. "It is now 20 minutes past midnight. The new year has begun. Let us see what other surprises it has in store for us. Hastings, if you would be so good as to escort these ladies and gentlemen back to the hall. I wish to speak with the doctor and the dead." The heavy mahogany doors closed behind Hastings and the remaining suspects, leaving Hercule Poirot and Dr. Arbuthnot alone in the silence of the library. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the faint, sweet scent of the gardenias that sat in a crystal bowl on the side table. Poirot did not immediately speak. He walked to the center of the room and stood with his feet perfectly aligned with the pattern of the rug, his eyes sweeping across the bookshelves and the fireplace. "Symmetry, Doctor," Poirot said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "The human mind craves it. When a man builds a room like this, he builds it to reflect his soul. Everything in its place, a book for every gap, a chair for every corner. And yet, look at our scene. It is a composition that has been ruined by a clumsy hand." Dr. Arbuthnot cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the body of his old friend. "Death is rarely symmetrical, Poirot. It is a messy, haphazard business, even for a man as orderly as Alister." "Perhaps," Poirot conceded, stepping closer to the desk. "But let us look at the mess. You are a man of science. Tell me, from a medical perspective, what does this wound say to you?" "Do not be afraid to be precise. I have a great affection for precision." The doctor sighed, leaning over the desk but careful not to touch anything. "The bullet entered the right temple. The trajectory is slightly upward. As I mentioned before, there are no powder burns on the skin, which means the muzzle of the weapon was at least 3 to 4 feet away. It was instantaneous. He never felt a thing. And the time of death? Well, given that Hastings heard the thud and the glass break at the stroke of midnight, and the body is still warm, I should say it happened exactly when the lights went out, not a second before or after." Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on the water stain he had noticed earlier. It was drying now, leaving a faint, ghostly ring on the dark wood of the desk. He leaned down, sniffing the air again. "Doctor, do you find it unusual that Sir Alister, a man known for his hatred of the cold, would be sitting at his desk with the French windows unlatched? He was a man of habit, was he not? He was a fanatic about draughts," Arbuthnot agreed. "He used to complain if a door was left ajar in the far wing of the house. It is odd. Perhaps he opened them for air? The room is quite warm from the fire. Or perhaps he opened them to admit a guest," Poirot suggested. "A guest who did not wish to come through the front door." But then we have the problem of the snow that is as smooth as a sheet. No, the guest did not come from the terrace, and yet the window was unlatched. Poirot moved to the mantelpiece. He picked up the photograph of the first wife, Cecilia, which he had righted earlier. He looked at the shattered glass in the frame. "A study in symmetry, Doctor. Look at the ornaments on this shelf. 2 silver candlesticks, 2 jade figurines, and in the center this photograph. When the glass broke, it fell forward. Why? If a man is shot at the desk 10 feet away, why does a photograph on the mantelpiece fall forward? The vibrations, Arbuthnot offered, or perhaps the killer knocked it over in the dark." "In the dark, one knocks things over by accident," Poirot said. "One stumbles, one gropes. But this room, it is not cluttered. To reach this mantelpiece from the desk in total darkness, then return to the desk to steal a codicil, then vanish through a locked door or a window that leaves no tracks. It is a dance of great complexity, is it not?" Poirot's gaze shifted to the fireplace. He knelt down, a difficult maneuver for a man of his build and sartorial dignity, and peered at the charred fragment of paper he had noted earlier. He did not touch it, but he blew softly on the ashes. "The codicil," Poirot murmured. "Sir Alister intended to sign it at midnight. He told his family this. He went into the library to be alone with his pen. And yet, here we find the remains of a document burned in the grate. If he intended to sign it, why burn it? And if someone else burned it, why do so here, in the very room where the body lies? He might have changed his mind at the last moment," the doctor suggested. "Remorse is a powerful thing, Poirot. Perhaps he couldn't go through with disinheriting his own flesh and blood. Remorse does not usually arrive with a bullet to the temple," Poirot countered. He stood up, brushing a speck of dust from his knee. "No, Doctor, there is a pattern here, but it is a pattern with a missing piece, like a jigsaw puzzle, of the sky where one piece of blue is lost. One looks at the whole and sees nothing but the whole. The whole is the most important part." He turned back to the desk, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the grandfather clock visible through the open library door. The clock, it chimes. The lights, they fail. The glass, it breaks. The water, it melts. It is all very theatrical, is it not? And I, Hercule Poirot, do not like the theatre when it is performed in the house of death. I prefer the truth. He looked at Dr. Arbuthnot with a sudden piercing intensity. "Tell me, Doctor, how long have you been treating Lady Margaret for her, shall we say, nervous disposition?" Arbuthnot stiffened. "I fail to see the relevance of my mistress's health to this tragedy. In a house where the master is murdered," Poirot said, "everything is relevant, even the nerves of a lady who sits on a settee and watches the clock as if it were an executioner." Poirot walked to the door and opened it, signalling the end of their private conference. "Come, Doctor, let us rejoin the living. I have a desire to hear more about the late Lady Cecilia. It seems she is the only one in this house who is not currently lying to me." The great hall was a cavern of long shadows and hushed whispers. The suspects had retreated to their various corners, looking like chess pieces awaiting the next move of a grandmaster. As Poirot and Dr. Arbuthnot re-entered, the eyes of the family turned toward them with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. "The police? They will not arrive for many hours," Poirot announced, his voice carrying through the hall with a bell-like clarity. "The snow, it has isolated us. We are in a world of our own, where the only law is the logic of Hercule Poirot. And so we must proceed. Tread well." The butler stepped forward from the shadows of the dining room. "Yes, monsieur, you are a man of order, I can see that," Poirot said, nodding approvingly at the man's perfectly aligned waistcoat. "Earlier, when the lights failed, you went to the cellar, but before that, when Sir Alister went to the library, did you happen to observe the movements of the guests?" Treadwell hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Julian Vane. I was busy with the champagne, monsieur, but I did see Mr. Julian leave the hall shortly after his father locked the library door." Julian bolted upright in his chair, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "I went to get a breath of air. I told you the tension was unbearable." "A breath of air in a blizzard, monsieur?" Poirot inquired delicately. "And did you, by any chance, take your overcoat from the cloakroom? I might have." Poirot turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, if you would be so kind. The overcoat's in the cloakroom. I believe Mr. Julian's is the one of the fine navy wool with the velvet collar." Hastings, sensing the shift in the room's energy, hurried to the foyer. A moment later he returned, carrying the heavy coat. His face was grim. He reached into the right-hand pocket and pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a cry. "I found it, Poirot," Hastings said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's been fired. I can smell the cordite." Dr. Arbuthnot stepped forward, taking the weapon from Hastings with a handkerchief. He opened the cylinder. "1 round spent .22 caliber. This matches the wound exactly." The evidence was damning. The room seemed to shrink around Julian Vane. The motive, the looming disinheritance, coupled with the opportunity of the darkness and the discovery of the murder weapon in his own pocket, created a noose of logic that seemed to tighten with every passing second. "Julian!" Lady Margaret wailed. "Tell them it isn't true. Tell them you didn't do it." Julian collapsed back into his seat, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't. I found the gun. It was on the floor in the hallway after." The lights came back on. I panicked. I thought someone was trying to frame me, so I hid it. I swear, I never went into the library. "The classic defense," Dr. Arbuthnot said, his voice cold. "You expect us to believe the killer simply dropped the weapon at your feet and you decided to pocket it for safekeeping? It's an open and shut case, Poirot," Hastings remarked, looking at the Belgian with a mixture of relief and sadness. "The locked room, the darkness. Julian must have had a duplicate key, or perhaps his father let him in before the lights went out. He killed him, took the codicil, and tossed the gun when he heard the butler coming." The suspects looked at Julian with loathing or pity, the mystery seemingly solved. But Poirot remained standing in the center of the rug, his head tilted to the side, his eyes fixed on the small revolver in the doctor's hand. He did not look relieved. He looked profoundly dissatisfied. "It is beautiful, is it not?" Poirot said suddenly. "The solution, it is so neat, it is so symmetrical. It satisfies the mind that wishes to go to bed and forget the blood on the carpet." "What are you saying, Poirot?" Hastings asked. "I am saying," Poirot replied, stepping toward Julian and gently lifting the young man's arm to inspect the smudge on his cuff, "that this is the first falsehood of the evening. It is a lie told with the truth." He turned back to the room, his eyes sparking with a sudden, sharp intelligence. "You say this gun killed Sir Alister. You say Julian Vane is the assassin because the weapon was in his pocket. But I ask you to look, really look, at the symmetry of this crime. If Julian killed his father and stole the codicil, why did he leave the gun in his coat? A man who is clever enough to navigate a dark house and vanish from a locked room is not a man who forgets a revolver in his pocket like a piece of loose change." Poirot leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic purr. "And there is the matter of the smudge. You see this, Doctor? It is ink, fresh ink. But it is not the ink from the desk of Sir Alister. It is the ink of a fountain pen, a very specific fountain pen that Julian was using to drum against his thigh earlier this evening." Poirot straightened his back, his expression turning stern. "No, my friends, we are being led by the nose. Someone wants us to believe the case is closed. Someone has placed the truth where we could not fail to find it. But Hercule Poirot does not like to be told what to think. This gun, it is a lead of the most false. It is a distraction from the broken glass and the melting snow." He looked at Julian, who was staring at him in dazed hope. "You are a fool, Monsieur Julian, and a coward. But I do not yet think you are a murderer. The little grey cells, they tell me that the real play has only just begun." Poirot did not allow Julian Vane to be led away, nor did he allow the tension in the room to dissipate into the simple relief of a solved crime. Instead, he requested that the company move into the yellow drawing room, a space of gilded mirrors and uncomfortable Louis XV chairs that seemed designed to make the occupant feel exposed. He took his place by the fireplace, the light of the embers reflecting in his sharp dark eyes like two tiny flickering candles. "In every crime," Poirot began, his voice taking on the instructional tone of a professor, "there is the how and there is the why. You, my friends, are obsessed with the how. How did the gun get into the pocket? How did the killer enter the room? But me, I look at the why. For the why is the fingerprint of the soul, and in this house the souls, they are very cluttered, are they not?" He turned his gaze toward Eleanor, who was perched on the edge of a settee, her cigarette smoke curling like a question mark in the air. "Mademoiselle Eleanor, you told us you were the secretary. You dealt with the correspondence of Sir Alister. You knew his mind, perhaps, better than his own son or wife. Tell me, what was the old man's greatest fear?" Eleanor laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Alister? Fear? He didn't know the meaning of the word. He was the one who instilled it in others. If you're asking what he was most protective of, it was his reputation. He spent 30 years building a monument to himself out of steel and shipping lines. He wouldn't let a single scratch appear on the name. And yet, Poirot mused, reputations are like the fine porcelain. Once cracked, they are never the same. You were unhappy here, mademoiselle. You felt the sting of his charity. Did you perhaps find something in his files, a crack in the porcelain?" Eleanor's eyes flickered, a brief microscopic hesitation before she regained her mask of indifference. "I found nothing but accounts and bills. If there were skeletons in the closet, Alister kept the key in his pocket. Or perhaps in his library," Poirot corrected softly. He shifted his attention to Lady Margaret. "Madame, let us speak of the First Lady Vane, the beautiful Cecilia. You were her companion before you were Sir Alister's wife, were you not? A most convenient transition." Lady Margaret's face went even paler, her hands clenching her lace handkerchief until her knuckles were white. I was her friend. When she passed, Alister was broken. I merely helped him pick up the pieces. It was a marriage of mutual support." "Mutual support," Poirot repeated, the words sounding heavy in the quiet room. "And the nature of her passing? Dr. Arbuthnot, you were the attending physician then, as you are now. It was a failure of the heart, I believe." "A long-standing condition," Arbuthnot replied curtly. "There was nothing suspicious about it, Poirot, if that is what you are implying. I signed the death certificate myself." "I imply nothing," Poirot said, though his eyebrows rose in a delicate arch. "I only observed the symmetry. A man dies in a locked room on the anniversary of a new beginning. A photograph of a dead wife falls and breaks at the exact moment of his death. A window is unlatched where no one has walked. These are not the actions of a clumsy thief or a panicked son. They are the actions of someone who is playing a game with the past." Poirot began to pace, his eyes never leaving their faces. He was like a cat watching a circle of mice, waiting for the one whisker to twitch. The psychology of a secret is a fascinating thing. It grows, it demands to be fed. Sir Alister was going to sign a document at midnight. He called you all together to witness his power, but I ask myself, was the codicil about money, or was it about the truth? Was he finally going to reveal the crack in the porcelain? "He was going to disinherit us," Julian cried out, his voice cracking. "That's all it was. He told me so. He said I wasn't fit to carry the name." "Perhaps," Poirot said, stopping in front of the young man. "But why wait until midnight? Why the theatricality? A man who wishes to change his will simply calls his lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon. No, the timing, it was a weapon. He wanted the year to end with a blow, and someone in this circle decided that the blow must fall upon Sir Alister instead." Poirot leaned in closer to the group, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "I noticed something in the library. A small thing. You see the water stain on the desk. It was not from the snow. I have looked at the ceiling. There is no leak. I have looked at the carafe. It is dry. That water, it came from something that was brought into the room and then taken away. Something cold, something that melts." He watched them. Dr. Arbuthnot's eyes narrowed. Lady Margaret looked away. Eleanor took a long, slow drag of her cigarette. "And then there is the thud," Poirot continued. "Captain Hastings heard a thud. We assumed it was the body falling, but the body was already in the chair. It did not fall to the floor. So I asked the little grey cells, what makes a thud in the dark? breaks a glass on the mantelpiece, and leaves a stain of water on the desk, all while the door is locked from the inside. He smiled, but it was a smile without mirth. It was the smile of a hunter who has seen the first drop of blood on the trail. The psychology, it is nearly complete. The secret, it is beginning to breathe. And now, I think it is time for the second crime to reveal itself. As if on cue, a muffled crash echoed from the upper floors of the manor, the sound of a heavy object falling, followed by a scream that cut through the house like a jagged blade. It was the voice of the maid, high and thin with terror. "The second act," Poirot murmured, turning toward the door. "It begins." The scream had barely faded when Poirot was already in motion, his short legs moving with a surprising nimble efficiency that left Hastings and the doctor momentarily stunned. They scrambled after him, the sound of their heavy footfalls echoing through the vaulted corridors of Blackwood Manor. The sound had come from the West Wing, a part of the house that Lady Margaret had earlier described as a shrine to the departed Cecilia. As they reached the heavy oak landing, a sharp, violent crack rang out. It was unmistakable, the dry, whip-like report of a small-caliber firearm. "Another shot!" Hastings cried, his hand instinctively reaching for a service revolver he no longer carried. "The symmetry, Hastings! It repeats itself!" Poirot shouted over his shoulder. They reached the door of the blue suite, the late Lady Cecilia's private chambers. The door was ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out onto the dark carpet. Poirot did not hesitate, he flung the door wide. The room was a frozen pocket of the Edwardian era. Pale blue silk wallpapers, heavy lace curtains, and the faint, cloying scent of dried violets. In the center of the room, Thomas, the young footman, lay sprawled across a needlepoint rug. He was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his white livery, his face a mask of bewildered agony. Near the window, the heavy velvet curtains were still swaying as if someone or something had just passed through them. "Thomas!" Dr. Arbuthnot rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the boy. "Hold still, lad. Let me see." Poirot did not look at the wounded man. His eyes were fixed on the window. He moved toward it, his feet silent on the thick carpet. The window was wide open, and the freezing night air poured in, smelling of pine and ozone. He looked out the balcony, then down at the ground. "The snow, Poirot," Hastings said, joining him. "The killer must have jumped." Poirot pointed downward. "And yet," Hastings observed, "the snow on the balcony is undisturbed. The snow on the ledge is a perfect smooth line. No one has jumped, no one has entered. And yet, the window is open and the boy is shot." He turned back to the room. His eyes swept the floor until they found it, a second revolver, identical to the one found in Julian's pocket, lying near the foot of the bed. But it was not the gun that held Poirot's attention. It was a small, ornate music box on the vanity table. Its lid was open, and it was tinkling a fragile, ghostly rendition of Auld Lang Syne. "The lady!" Thomas gasped, his voice a ragged whisper as the doctor tended to his wound. "I saw the lady. She was at the mirror. I thought it was a ghost. I came to tell her the master was—" And she turned. She had no face, monsieur, just a veil of black. She fired at me and she vanished into the wall." "Into the wall?" Julian, who had just arrived at the doorway with Lady Margaret and Eleanor, turned even paler. "This house, it's cursed. My mother's ghost has come back for us all." "Nonsense!" Eleanor snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "There are no ghosts in Blackwood, only secrets." Poirot walked to the vanity mirror. He touched the glass, then looked at his finger. A smudge of grey dust stayed on his skin. He then turned to the wall Thomas had indicated, a section of wood panelling between the wardrobe and the hearth. He tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was hollow but solid. "A secret passage, Poirot?" Hastings asked. "In a house this old, there is always a passage for the heart, Hastings, but for the body. We shall see." Poirot's gaze shifted to the music box. He closed the lid, silencing the melody. "Tell me, Thomas, before the ghost fired upon you, what were you doing in this wing? You were supposed to be in the kitchen, were you not?" Thomas looked down, shame crossing his face. I was the one, Monsieur Poirot. I pulled the fuse. A sharp intake of breath came from Lady Margaret. "Why, Thomas?" Poirot asked softly. "Who told you to plunge the house into darkness at the stroke of midnight?" "I was paid, monsieur. £100 in an envelope left in my pantry. The note said to pull the fuse when the clock struck 12, and to keep my mouth shut. I thought it was just a New Year's prank, a way for the guests to kiss in the dark, maybe. I didn't know someone would be killed. And the note? Poirot pressed. Who signed it? It wasn't signed, monsieur, but it was written on the blue stationery, the same paper the Lady Cecilia used to use. I recognized the crest. Poirot looked at Lady Margaret. Her eyes were wide, her hand trembling as she gripped the doorframe. This is the major reveal, is it not? Poirot said, his voice cold and clinical. The darkness was bought and paid for. The ghost of the past is walking the halls with a .22 caliber revolver, and the secret that Sir Alistair was going to sign away, it is not in the library. It is here, in the room of a woman who has been dead for 20 years. He walked to the center of the room and picked up the second revolver with his handkerchief. 2 guns, 2 shots, 1 dead master, 1 wounded servant. And yet the little grey cells tell me that the most important thing in this room is not the blood, nor the bullet. He pointed to the floor near the wardrobe. A small dark trail of droplets led toward the door. Water, Poirot whispered. Again the melting water. It seems the ghost of Lady Cecilia has a very cold touch indeed. He turned to the suspects, his eyes flashing with a terrible bright clarity. The game, it changes. We are no longer looking for a thief who stole a codicil. We are looking for a person who can be in 2 places at once and who uses the ice of the winter to commit the heat of murder. The chaos in the blue suite eventually subsided into a grim, watchful stillness. Thomas, the footman, had been moved to a settee where Dr. Arbuthnot worked with professional haste to bandage the shoulder wound. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the arm, painful but not fatal. The rest of the household stood in the corridor, shivering as the draught from the open window carried the bite of the midnight frost. Poirot, however, remained inside the room, standing before the heavy oak wardrobe. He was not looking at the blood, nor the discarded revolver. His eyes were fixed on the line where the wardrobe met the wood-panelled wall. He took a small magnifying glass from his pocket, an instrument he rarely used, preferring the eyes of the mind, and leaned in close to the floor. "Hastings," Poirot said, his voice barely a murmur, "bring the candle closer. The light in this room, it is designed for romance, not for the detection of truth." Hastings stepped forward, the flame flickering in the draught. As the light hit the base of the wardrobe, Poirot reached out with a pair of silver tweezers. With a delicate movement, he extracted a tiny shimmering thread caught in the heavy hinge of the panel. It was a fragment of green silk, no longer than a thumbnail, but its color was vibrant, the deep, lustrous green of an emerald. "Green silk," Hastings whispered, "but Lady Margaret is wearing black. Eleanor is in midnight blue. Who in this house wears green?" "It is not a question of who wears it, Hastings, but who owned it," Poirot replied, his eyes dark with a sudden somber understanding. He tucked the fragment into a small glassine envelope. "This silk is old. It has the weight of the pre-war years. It belongs to a time of grand balls and even grander tragedies." Poirot turned away from the wall and walked back to the vanity table. He looked again at the music box he had silenced. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked at the surface of the table. There, amidst the dust and the scent of dried violets, were several more droplets of water, now nearly evaporated. "The water again," Hastings noted, frustrated. "I don't understand it, Poirot. If there is no leak, and the snow hasn't been tracked in, where is it coming from? Is it some sort of psychic manifestation?" Poirot allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Psychic? No, Hastings. The spirits, they do not leave water behind as a calling card. The water is the key to the how. It is the most ingenious part of the play. Think, mon ami. What is water before it is water? It is ice. And what does ice do? It has weight, it has form, and then it vanishes. It is the perfect ghost that leaves no trace but a damp patch on a rug. Ice?" Hastings looked bewildered. "But what does ice have to do with a locked room murder and a shooting?" "Everything," Poirot said. He began to pace the small room, his hands behind his back. "Consider the library. A man is shot from 3 feet away. No weapon is found in the room. The door is locked from the inside. The window is unlatched, but the snow outside is undisturbed. Now imagine a mechanism, a weight made of ice perhaps, a cord, a way to fire a weapon and then have the weapon retreat through a window. or into a hiding place as the weight melts. And the thud you heard, Hastings, not the body but the weight hitting the floor, and the glass that broke, not the window but the frame knocked over by the recoiling. Cord. Hastings stared at him. It's brilliant, but it's madness. Who would go to such lengths? A person who knows that Hercule Poirot is in the house, Poirot said grimly. A person who wishes to turn a sordid murder into a supernatural legend. But they made a mistake, a small green mistake. He stopped at the window and looked out at the blackness of the estate. The fragment of silk tells me the who, the water tells me the how, but the why, that is still buried in the library, in the ashes of a burned codicil. He turned to the door, his expression one of absolute resolve. Doctor, is the boy stable? He'll live, Arbuthnot replied, wiping his hands on a towel. But he's terrified. He keeps talking about a woman with no face. The woman with no face is a very clever costume, Doctor, Poirot said. It is easy to be a ghost when you are wearing the clothes of the dead. Now I have seen enough. The pieces of the puzzle, they are no longer scattered. They are beginning to form a picture that is very ugly indeed. He looked at the gathered suspects, his gaze resting briefly on each of them. I require all of you to return to the library. Yes, I know the body of Sir Alister is still there, but it is only fitting. We began this year with a death. We shall begin the truth in the presence of the man who took his secrets to the grave. Now, Poirot? Lady Margaret asked, her voice trembling. It is nearly 2 a.m. The truth does not keep office hours, madame, Poirot said sternly. And I think, for some of you, sleep would be quite impossible anyway. As they began the slow procession back to the library, Poirot leaned toward Hastings and whispered, The final piece, Hastings. I found it in the library when I first entered, but I did not see it. I saw it with the eyes, but not with the brain. A man who hates draughts, but leaves his window unlatched. Why? Not to let a killer in, but to let a ghost out. The library had been transformed from a place of quiet study into a stage for a final grim performance. The body of Sir Alister Vane remained exactly where it had fallen, a silent, slumped reminder of the stakes of the evening. Poirot had insisted that the lighting be restored to the way it was before the clock struck. Midnight, save for the fire, which had dwindled to a heap of glowing red eyes in the hearth. The suspects were arranged in a semicircle of chairs, their faces etched with exhaustion and an underlying current of terror. Lady Margaret sat to the far left, her fingers incessantly pleating the fabric of her black skirt. Beside her, Julian looked like a man who had already been condemned, his eyes staring blankly at the rug. Eleanor leaned against a bookshelf, her cynical facade beginning to crack, while Dr. Arbuthnot stood by the mantelpiece, his arms crossed in a defensive posture. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice surprisingly gentle in the heavy silence. We find ourselves at the end of a very long night. The year 1925 has passed away, and it has taken with it the life of a man who ruled this house with an iron hand. You are all tired, you are all cold, and you are all, I think, very much afraid of what I am about to say. He began to pace the narrow space between the suspects and the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. We were presented with a miracle, Poirot continued. A man is shot in a room where the doors are locked from the inside. The windows are closed. No one enters, no one leaves. And yet the weapon vanishes, and the document he was to sign is reduced to ash. It is the impossible crime, is it not? A ghost story for a New Year's Eve. We've seen the ghost, Poirot, Julian muttered, his voice hoarse. Thomas was shot by it. My mother's spirit— Ah, the ghost, Poirot exclaimed, raising a finger. The woman with no face in the blue suite, the music box that plays by itself, the scent of dried violets. It is a very pretty play, Monsieur Julian. It is designed to make us look into the shadows of the past rather than the facts of the present. But Hercule Poirot does not believe in the supernatural. He believes in the little grey cells and the stubbornness of physical laws. He stopped in front of the desk and pointed to the small, faint ring of water that was now nearly invisible on the wood. The water, it is the signature of a very modern mind. To kill a man in a locked room, one must have a way to bridge the distance without being present. I spoke of ice, a block of ice suspended outside that window attached to a cord. The cord runs through the unlatched window, around the frame of the photograph on the mantel, and is tied to the trigger of a revolver resting on this desk. When the ice melts, or is triggered to fall, the weight pulls the cord, the gun fires, the recoil and the falling weight pull the weapon and the cord back through the window and into the darkness of the snow, where it can be retrieved later. The thud you heard, Hastings, was the weight hitting the stone terrace. The broken glass was the frame being jerked over by the returning line. A stunned silence followed. Dr. Arbuthnot let out a short, sharp laugh. A Rube Goldberg machine for murder? It's too complex, Poirot. Too many things could go wrong. Exactly, Poirot's eyes flashed. It is the crime of an intellectual, a person who thinks they are more clever than the police, and certainly more clever than a funny little Frenchman. But this person made a mistake. They forgot that while ice melts it leaves a trace, and they forgot that a ghost must have a wardrobe. Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the glassine envelope containing the fragment of green silk. This thread was caught in a secret panel in the blue suite, a panel that leads from the library's hidden service passage to the late Lady Cecilia's rooms. The person who shot Thomas was not a ghost. They were wearing a costume, a dress of emerald green silk that belonged to the First Lady Vane, a dress that has been kept in a cedar chest for 20 years. He turned to Lady Margaret. "You knew where that dress was kept, madame. You were her companion." Lady Margaret's breath hitched. I haven't touched those things in years. I wouldn't even fit." "In her clothes, true," Poirot conceded, "but Eleanor would. And Eleanor is a woman who knows the secrets of the Vane correspondence. She knew about the first wife's heart condition, or should we call it by its true name? A slow, systematic poisoning that Dr. Arbuthnot was too loyal, or perhaps too well paid, to notice." The doctor's face turned a violent shade of purple. "That is a monstrous accusation, is it?" Poirot asked. Sir Alister was going to sign a codicil. We all assumed it was to disinherit his son. But what if it was a confession? What if in his old age he grew a conscience? What if he was going to reveal the truth about Cecilia's death and name his accomplice? That would be a motive for murder, would it not? Not to gain a fortune, but to stay out of the hangman's noose. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on the shadows beneath their eyes. The lights went out because Thomas was paid to pull the fuse. But the person who paid him knew that the darkness would provide the perfect cover for the mechanical shot. The person who shot Thomas later did so to ensure he would be too terrified to speak of the bribe. But the truth, like the new year, cannot be stopped by a locked door or a veil of black lace. Poirot straightened his jacket and looked at the grandfather clock. "The time for games is over. The actor is on the stage, and I am about to bring down the curtain." Poirot stood by the desk, his shadow cast long and thin by the dying fire, looking like the hand of a sundial marking the final hour. He picked up a small silver paper knife and turned it over in his hands, watching the light dance along its edge. "A lie, mes amis, is rarely a solid wall," Poirot began, his voice dropping to a low melodic register. "It is more like a tapestry. One pulls a single thread, perhaps a thread of green silk, perhaps a drop of melted ice, and the entire image begins to distort. We have spent this night looking at the image the killer wished us to see, the image of a son's greed or a ghost's vengeance. But let us now look at the back of the tapestry, where the knots are messy and the truth is hidden." He turned his gaze toward Dr. Arbuthnot, who remained stiff and silent by the mantelpiece. "Doctor, you are a man of science. You spoke of the surgical precision of the wound. You spoke of the impossibility of suicide. You even confirmed that the weapon found in Monsieur Julien's pocket was the instrument of death. You were so very helpful. Too helpful, perhaps? A doctor's role is to observe, but you were directing the play." "I was merely answering your questions, Poirot," Arbuthnot snapped, his jaw tightening. "And yet," Poirot continued, "you were the one who suggested that Sir Alister's remorse might have led him to burn the codicil. You were the one who insisted the First Lady Vane died of a long-standing condition. But let us look at the anatomy of that particular lie. If Sir Alister was truly remorseful, why did he not simply destroy the document in private? Why invite the audience? Why wait for the stroke of midnight? No, the burning of that paper was not an act of remorse. It was an act of desperation, but not by the man who owned the pen. Poirot moved toward the fireplace and pointed to the charred remains in the grate. To burn a document in a room with a dead body, one must have time. But the killer, according to the ice mechanism, was never in the room at the moment of the shot. So when was the paper burned? It was burned after the door was broken down. It was burned in the confusion, while Captain Hastings was rushing to the window and the servants were crying out. Someone stayed behind by the desk for 5 seconds too long. Someone with the steady hands of a surgeon. A sharp gasp came from Lady Margaret. She looked at the doctor as if seeing him for the first time. "But the gun," Julian cried. "The gun was in my pocket. I told you I found it in the hallway." "And you did." "Monsieur Julian," Poirot said, nodding. "But you did not find it by accident. It was placed there by a ghost. Eleanor, you have been very quiet. Tell me, how does it feel to wear the silk of a dead woman? To walk through a secret passage and play the part of a vengeful spirit?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She met Poirot's gaze with a cold, iron-hard stare. "I told you I'd do anything to avoid being on the street. If the doctor offered me a way to ensure the codicil, the one that would have sent us both to the gallows for what happened to Cecilia, vanished, why wouldn't I help him?" "Eleanor, no," Lady Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, shut up, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with venom. You always knew Alistair was a murderer, and you knew the doctor helped him. You just liked the pearls too much to say anything. But Alistair got old. He got religion. He was going to confess everything in that codicil, how he and Arbuthnot had slowly replaced Cecilia's medicine with arsenic 20 years ago. He was going to clear his soul by ruining ours. "The anatomy of the lie is nearly complete," Poirot said, his eyes darkening. "The doctor provided the mechanism, the ice from the medical chest, the cord from his own bag. He set the trap before the guests gathered. Eleanor provided the theatre, donning the old dress to move through the house unseen, to pull the fuse, and later to silence Thomas when he became a liability. It was a partnership of the most cynical kind. One provided the mind, the other the movement." Arbuthnot took a step forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have no proof, Poirot. A thread of silk and a theory about melting ice. No jury in England will convict a man of my standing on such fairy tales. The gun was in Julian's pocket. The door was locked. You are chasing shadows." "Am I?" Poirot inquired softly. He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk cloth. "You see, Doctor, you were very careful with the ice and the cord. You were very careful to retrieve the first gun from the terrace after it had been jerked out the window. But in your haste to return to the hall and play the shocked physician, you forgot one thing, the symmetry." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small brass weight, the kind used in old grandfather clocks. This was the thud Hastings heard. It did not melt like the ice. It fell into the deep snow beneath the library window. I found it while you were tending to Thomas. And look, it is tied with a very specific type of suturing silk, the kind that only a doctor carries in his bag, a silk that matches the thread caught in the trigger of the second gun. The doctor's composure finally shattered. He looked at the weight, then at Eleanor, then at the silent, accusing eyes of the room. The silence was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. "The lie is dissected, Doctor," Poirot said, his voice as cold as the winter outside. "And now we shall see how it breathes in the light of the morning." The brass weight lay on the silk cloth like a spent shell, its dull gleam a silent accusation. Dr. Arbuthnot stared at it, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. The room seemed to contract, the tall bookshelves pressing in like the walls of a cell. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic, mocking tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had governed the life of Blackwood Manor for a century and had now heralded its ruin. "The hand on the pendulum," Poirot said, his voice soft but resonant. "It is a metaphor for your life, is it not, Doctor? You thought you could control the time. You thought you could stop the clock at midnight and freeze the truth in the darkness of the old year. But time, it does not stop for the convenience of murderers. It marches on, and it leaves behind the debris of our mistakes." Arbuthnot's gaze shifted from the weight to Poirot. The mask of the dignified physician was gone, replaced by the predatory sharpness of a cornered animal, a weight and some silk. "You think that's enough? I've lived in this county for 30 years. I am a pillar of this community. You are a foreigner with a penchant for melodrama, "A foreigner who understands the human heart," Poirot replied, unruffled, "and a foreigner who knows that a pillar, when hollowed out by crime, must eventually crumble." "You speak of melodrama, but was it not you who designed the most melodramatic death of the century? The ice, the cord, the ghost in the green silk. You did not merely want to kill Sir Alistair, you wanted to create a legend that would bury the truth of Lady Cecilia's death forever. If the house were haunted, who would look for a medical report? If the devil took Sir Alistair in a locked room, who would look for arsenic in a grave 2 decades old?" Poirot turned to the window, gesturing toward the terrace. "The ice was your masterstroke. You took a block of ice from the kitchen's cold storage, a simple thing, yet brilliant. You tied the suturing silk around it, looped it through the unlatched window, and attached it to the trigger of the revolver. You calculated the melting point, the weight required to pull the trigger at the precise moment the clock struck 12 and the lights went out. The thud was the weight of the brass and the ice hitting the stone. But the ice, it has the impudence to melt. It turns to water and disappears, leaving only the dampness I found on the desk." "And the second shot?" Hastings asked, leaning forward. "Why shoot the footman?" "Because Thomas was the only one who could connect the doctor to the darkness," Poirot explained. "The doctor paid him, but the doctor realized that Thomas was weak. He was a boy who would crack under the gaze of Hercule Poirot, and so the ghost was dispatched. Eleanor, wearing the dress and the veil, went to the blue suite. But she is not a markswoman. She missed the heart and hit the shoulder, and in her flight she dropped the second revolver, the twin to the one the doctor had already planted in Monsieur Julian's pocket, to ensure a convenient scapegoat." Eleanor let out a jagged, bitter laugh. She was leaning against the mahogany door, her arms crossed. "He promised me a share of the estate, Poirot. He said if we destroyed the codicil and kept the old secrets buried, Margaret would be too frightened to contest anything. I'd never have to beg for a dress or a meal again. I didn't care about Alistair. He was a monster who killed his first wife and expected us to worship his memory. He was a man who grew afraid of the dark," Poirot corrected, "and in his fear, he became a danger to you. He wanted to confess. He wanted to name his accomplice in the murder of Cecilia. He was the hand on the pendulum, and you and the doctor, decided to cut the cord." Dr. Arbuthnot's hand moved suddenly, reaching toward his medical bag on the side table, but Hastings was faster, stepping between the doctor and the bag, his face set in a mask of grim determination. "The game is over, Arbuthnot," Hastings said. "The police are already on their way. The snowplows have reached the gates." The doctor's shoulders slumped, the defiance drained out of him, leaving behind a tired old man whose crimes had finally caught up with the ticking of the clock. He looked at Lady Margaret, who was weeping silently into her hands, and then at Julian, who looked at him with a mixture of horror and pity. "He wouldn't let it go," Arbuthnot whispered, his voice barely audible. "Alistair couldn't just die with his secrets. He had to take me with him. I saved him once 20 years ago. I gave him the life he wanted. I thought that bought me my own." "No one can buy a life, Doctor," Poirot said, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "One can only borrow it. And the debt is always paid in the end." Poirot walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. The sun was beginning to rise over the white horizon, a pale, cold gold that touched the snow with the first light of the new year. The darkness of Blackwood Manor was receding, but the chill remained. "The truth," Poirot murmured, "is like the sun. It is not always warm, and it is often blinding, but it is the only thing that allows us to see the path ahead." He turned back to the room, the master of the House of Shadows, his task nearly complete. "The officers are at the door, Treadwell. You may let them in. The new year has arrived, and it has brought with it the justice of the old." The police arrived as the first thin rays of the January sun began to turn the snow-covered grounds of Blackwood Manor into a landscape of blinding crystalline white. The heavy rumble of the police vehicles and the crisp, authoritative voices of Inspector Miller and his men broke the spell of the long, claustrophobic night. There was no struggle. Dr. Arbuthnot went with a cold, stony dignity that seemed to be the last refuge of his profession, while Eleanor was led away with a look of defiant weariness, her green silk secrets finally laid bare to the light of day. In the great hall, the fire had been rebuilt. and the smell of fresh coffee began to replace the lingering scent of gunpowder and dried violets. Lady Margaret had retired to her rooms, sedated by a local nurse, leaving Julian Vane alone by the hearth. He looked older than he had 12 hours ago, the weight of his father's sins and his own narrow escape from the gallows pressing down upon his narrow shoulders. "What happens now, Monsieur Poirot?" Julian asked, his voice hollow. "The codicil is gone. The truth about my mother is out. The Varney name is—" "It is in the mud." Poirot, who was meticulously brushing a microscopic speck of ash from his sleeve, looked up with eyes that held a surprising warmth. "The name, Monsieur Julian, is but a label on a bottle. It is the wine inside that matters. Your father spent his life trying to preserve the label while the—" Wine turned to vinegar. "Now you have the chance to start again. The truth is painful, yes, but it is also a great cleanser. It has washed away the rot. What you build upon the ruins is up to you." Julian nodded slowly. I think I should like to close the house for a while, perhaps travel. Somewhere where it doesn't snow. A most sensible plan," Poirot agreed. "The sun of the south, it is very good for the soul and for the moustaches which do not like the frost." A short while later, Poirot and Hastings stood on the front steps, watching as the luggage was loaded into a car. The air was sharp and invigorating, the kind of cold that seemed to promise a truly fresh beginning. Hastings turned to his friend, his brow furrowed in thought. "You know, Poirot," Hastings said, "it was the ice that really did it. I keep thinking about that block of ice melting on the desk while we were all standing in the hall. It's so clinical, so detached. It was the crime of a man who viewed human life as an experiment, Hastings," Poirot replied, pulling on his grey suede gloves. "The doctor saw a problem, the confession of Sir Alister, and he applied a scientific solution. But he forgot the most important element of any experiment, the human factor. He forgot that a footman might be greedy, that a niece might be bitter, and that Hercule Poirot does not like to have his evening interrupted by the supernatural." "And the green silk?" Hastings asked. "How did you know it wasn't just a stray thread from a rug?" "Because, my friend, there is no green silk in the library of Blackwood Manor. Sir Alister hated the colour green. He said it reminded him of the sea, and the sea made him ill. To find a thread of such vibrant emerald in a house of blacks, browns, and blues, it was like a shout in a library. It told me that someone had been where they did not belong, wearing something that did not exist." They settled into the back of the car, and the driver began the slow descent down the winding, salted driveway. Poirot leaned back against the upholstery, closing his eyes with a sigh of immense satisfaction. "It has been a most productive New Year, Hastings. We have seen the death of a lie and the birth of a truth. We have seen that, even in the most locked of rooms, the human spirit and the little grey cells can find a way out. Are you going to take a holiday now, Poirot?" Hastings asked with a smile. "I hear the Riviera is lovely this time of year." Poirot opened one eye and looked at his friend with a twinkle of mischief. "Perhaps, Hastings, but only if there are no clocks, no secret passages, and absolutely no ice except that which is served in a very tall, very sweet glass of grenadine. I have had quite enough of the frozen truth for 1 year." As the car reached the main road, Poirot reached into his pocket and pulled out his pocket watch. He checked the time, then wound it with a delicate, rhythmic precision. "The order, Hastings," Poirot murmured as the car sped away from the shadows of Blackwood Manor. "The method, they are the only things that remain constant in a world of change. Now tell me, do you think we can find a place in the village that serves a breakfast with perfectly symmetrical toast?" "My appetite, it has returned with a vengeance."